Hello everyone, welcome to What If Luffy ate Hie Hie no Me Part 4, Chapter 14, Reverse Mountain. Luffy's crew were all standing at the front of the ship as it raced up the rapid stream, the water dissipating to mist and vapor as the water crashed into the wooden hull of the ship. Luffy sat on the figurehead of the Going Merry, looking at the mountain peak with an excited grin as he reminisced about his past with Shanks in the Grand Line. Now it'll be even more exciting. He thought happily. We're nearing the peak. Nami shouted out. Brace yourselves. Luffy exclaimed in warning, gripping the rails. As the whole crew braced, the ship reached the peak and stayed airborne for a moment before crashing onto the downward stream with a splash, making the crew stumble before looking ahead of the ship. Smirking, Luffy turned and shouted to the crew. As soon as we break these clouds, we'll only be seconds away from entering the Grand Line, the wildest sea in the world. As he was shouting, the ship broke through the layer of clouds, showing the crew the side of the wide blue expanse of the Grand Line with a large black mass at the end of the stream. Phew. A deep bellow boomed from all around the crew, causing them to cringe at the volume. What the hell is that? Sanji shouted in question, pointing at the large mass. Turning around, confused Luffy saw the giant shadow and gaped. That wasn't here last time. He thought, but seeing an open space to the left, Luffy felt a small glimmer of hope. Turning back to his crew, Luffy pointed at Zoro. Zoro. You and Sanji get to the rudder and turn left on my order. He shouted out. But the rudder's broken. Usopp shouted back, giving Luffy the dreadful realization. Is that a whale? Najiko shouted in confusion. How can a whale be that big? Zoro exclaimed. Damn it. He thought in slight panic, his brain thinking at a mile a second before getting an idea. This better work. He thought, walking to Mary's head and standing on it. Luffy, what are you doing? Johnny exclaimed in confusion as the bellow sounded out again, making everyone cringe again. Something dangerous. Luffy replied flatly as the ship raced towards the giant whale. We're gonna crash. Nami shouted in fear, clenching her eyes shut. Nope. Luffy muttered as he leaned forward and fell off of Mary's figurehead, righting himself so that he could put his hands on the hull of the ship and tensed his legs. Geppo. Picking his legs away from the ship, Luffy sped up his legs faster and faster until they were only blurs accompanied by small sonic booms with each impact of his feet. As Luffy pushed his legs to the limit, the ship began to slow to a stop just in front of the gargantuan whale. As the ship stopped, the crew let out sighs of relief. Luffy jumped and landed on the deck in a crouch, glancing around curiously. That old man is supposed to be out here. Where is he? He thought, confused. His train of thought was broken when he heard his crew shout out. We need to row our way out of here. They shouted, the oars already out and ready to row. Luffy went and started rowing with the crew when the whale bellowed again, louder than before, piercing their eardrums. Luffy's eyes widened slightly when he saw the whale's mouth opened up wider and wider until its lower jaw was below the water, causing the ocean to pour into the gaping maw. We're gonna be swallowed whole. Luffy thought with wide eyes as the ship was getting pulled in by the artificial current. We're getting pulled in. Usopp shouted in fear with tears streaming down his cheeks, looking at the whale with terrified eyes. Luffy's last thought before the crew and ship was swallowed whole by the whale was, now ain't this a pickle? Scene skip. Where are we? Yusaku stuttered out in confusion. Weren't we just eaten by that whale? Jin said questioningly. Maybe we're dead and this is heaven. Usopp suggested. No, Usopp, this isn't heaven, Luffy said, scanning the area around them, and we sure as hell aren't dead. He finished, noticing an island in front of them. What's an island doing here? He muttered to himself. His train of thought and the deafening silence was shattered by a giant squid bursting through the liquid below them, startling everyone. Luffy planted a hand on his sword and was about to attack when multiple harpoons shot through the cephalopod's body, spraying blood everywhere, surprising the crew. Looks like we're not alone. Zoro said with a smirk, watching the squid's body getting dragged towards the small island. Who's that? Jin asked no one in particular, squinting to try to get a better look. Looks like a flower. Johnny said, noticing the flower-like figure. That's no flower. Luffy observed, narrowing his eyes. That's a crazy old man. He said, and true to his words the figure wasn't a flower, but an old man that had a white beard, a floral print shirt and a scar across his left bicep. The old man was pulling in the rope from the harpoons that had speared the giant squid as he looked at the crew with a seemingly studious gaze. The silence was deafening as the old man walked towards a beach chair that was sitting under an umbrella with a fierce glare set in his eyes and directed straight at Sanji, who was sweating profusely, and his visible eye was wide with shock and a small amount of fear. The glare in the man's eye was filled with bloodlust and a murderous ferocity that lacked any mercy. He wouldn't let any of them leave with air. The silence was cut off when the old man simply sat on his beach chair and leisurely opened a newspaper, enraging Sanji. At least say something, asshole. He shouted, causing the man to look up from the paper and look directly at Sanji. Usopp, Johnny and Yusaku could be heard shouting. Is it a fight you want, bastard? Come at us, we got a cannon right here. Though their words said one thing, their actions spoke another as they were hiding in the kitchen area with fearful expressions. "You should be careful with that cannon," the old man spoke with a calm tone, "or else someone might get hurt." He said with an underlying threat, scaring Johnny, Nami, Yusaku and Usopp as they grew blue in the face and squealed quietly in terror. "Oh? And who might that be?" Sanji asked back in a confident tone, getting some of his anger hidden away. The simple one-word answer sent Sanji into a furious shout again. "You?" he shouted, a vein pulsing on his forehead and his one visible eye showing immense amounts of anger raging within. Zoro clapped a hand on Sanji's shoulder, pulling him back from the railing and stepping forward himself. Now, calm down," he said with a smirk. "Hey, old man, we're wondering where we are, who you are, and how we can get out of here." The old man glared in response as a few moments of deafening silence boomed throughout the room until he spoke again. "When asking someone their name, it's polite manners to introduce yourself first." Caught slightly off guard, Zoro stuttered a bit before replying. "Ooh, sorry about that. My name is Roro." As Zoro was going to introduce himself, he was interrupted by the old man. "I am Crocus, the lighthouse keeper of the Twin Capes. I am 71 years old, a Gemini, and I have AB blood type." Crocus introduced casually, frustrating and enraging Zoro. "Is it alright if I kill him?" Zoro shouted with bloodlust in his eyes and a vein pulsing on his forehead. "You're wondering where you are? You trespass on my private resort and then mouth off with that attitude?" Crocus asked with an annoyed tone and a frown on his face. "Does this place look like a mouse stomach to you? So we really were swallowed by that whale?" Usopp asked himself in shock. "What are we gonna do?" Nami asked with her hands on her face. "I don't want to be digested," she muttered in fear. "Well," Luffy said, gaining the attention of his crew, "we could sail out of its ass." He suggested with a shrug, instantly gaining glares of disgust from the women of the crew. "No way." They all shouted, bringing their fists down on his head, only to have him disappear and reappear behind them. Sighing, Luffy frowned. "If you guys let me finish, I would have said it was a joke," he said, scratching his head, "then I would have said that there's a giant door over there that we can use as an exit," he said, pointing over his shoulder at a pair of giant steel doors that led out of the whale's stomach. "You mean you can get out of here?" The crew shouted before the stomach acid started splashing and crashing around, knocking the ship around. "What the hell is happening?" Alvida shouted, her fruit powers being her bane as she slid around the deck, having no way to stop from sliding across the deck. "So he's starting again?" Crocus muttered to himself, somehow catching Zoro's attention. "What do you mean by that?" Zoro exclaimed over the crashing waves. Crocus looked at the pirates with a serious gaze. "This whale has started bashing his head against the red line again," he explained, shocking the crew. Nami's face peaked in realization. "Now that he explains it, it makes sense now," she exclaimed. His forehead was covered in scars and he was bellowing at the sky. She said, causing Usopp to look confused. "What does it mean?" he asked curiously. "It means that the whale is suffering," she explained before her eyes widened slightly in realization and turning to Crocus. "He must be trying to kill the whale from the inside," she exclaimed. "What a nasty way to kill something," Usopp exclaimed with slight disgust in his tone. Luffy sighed, shaking his head. "He's not trying to kill the whale," he explained, confusing Nami and Usopp. "If anything, he's trying his absolute best to keep this whale alive," he said as Crocus dived into the stomach acid. "Good, now that mystery's solved, we need to get out of here," Jin said. "We'll be dissolved if we hang around here any longer," he warned. "That's right, I don't care what this guy's trying to do myself, but we need to get out of here now," Sanji said. "That won't be any help if this whale keeps on rampaging like this," Zoro exclaimed, trying to keep his balance. "We just need to row our way out of here." As everyone was going to get the oars to row away, two people, a man and a woman, crashed through a smaller door that was on the giant steel door. "This Wednesday, there's a sea of stomach acid below us," the man said to the woman that was falling with him. "No," the woman screamed in fear. "The hell?" Zoro muttered to himself as the two splashed into the stomach acid. "Damn it, I'd feel bad if we just left those two to die," Luffy muttered with a slight frown. "Zoro, go save those two," Luffy ordered. "Alright," Zoro said with a sigh, diving into the stomach acid. Scene skip. Finally, the whale seemed to have calmed down. Najiko muttered, looking up at the painted sky. "Well," Nami asked the two people that were now aboard their ship, slightly annoyed, "who are you two?" "MMR. 9 These people seem to be pirates," the woman whispered to the man. "Do they think we can't hear them?" Luffy thought with a slightly raised brow. "Yes, I know Miss Wednesday, they seem understanding enough, though." Mr. 9, supposedly, whispered to Miss Wednesday, also supposedly. Suddenly, Crocus bellowed from the steel door, "I won't let you lay a single finger on Laboon until my last breath." For some reason Miss Wednesday and Mr. 9 started chuckling. Oh, Mr. Nine said with a smirk, standing with Miss Wednesday, cannons in hand, but we're inside the whale now. It'll only be too easy, Miss Wednesday started, hauling her bazooka to her shoulder. To blast a hole in this whale's stomach. Mr. Nine shouted as he and Miss Wednesday pulled their triggers, firing cannonballs at the stomach wall. Damn rogues. Crocus ground out as he ran to the railing of the catwalk he was on. Crocus jumped off of the catwalk and spread his arms and legs to take the cannonballs with his own body, which was then shrouded by the explosion that resulted from the hit. That old man took the blast with his own body. Usopp exclaimed in shock. Oh ho ho ho. Stop resisting, it's useless. Miss Wednesday shouted. Just try to protect this whale. You won't be able to stop us from making this our village's food. Mr. Nine shouted with arrogance. The hell is happening? Alvida asked dazedly, still slightly dizzy from the thrashing earlier. As the two were going to fire again, Luffy grabbed their heads and crashed them together, letting them fall limply to the deck. I'm not completely sure what's happening, but I'll knock these jackasses out for you, Crocus. Luffy said with a slight frown. Scene skip. This whale is an island whale that normally originates from the West Blue, it's the largest whale species in the world. Crocus explained. The whale is named Laboon, and these two, he jerked his thumb at the tied-up man and woman, are from a nearby town. Their goal is to hunt Laboon so that they can feed their village for a couple years at least. He explained. Luffy had a curious glint in his eyes as he studied the captive pair on the ground. I know I've heard names like theirs somewhere before. He thought, narrowing his eyes slightly in suspicion. But Crocus said looking determined, I won't allow that. As for why he keeps crashing his head on the red line and bellows at it, there's a reason for it. He explained, gaining a slightly somber tone to his voice. Long ago, a group of friendly pirates came down from Reverse Mountain, with a baby Laboon following them. He explained. It seemed that Laboon had joined them in their travel from West Blue, but the pirates had to leave Laboon behind to keep him safe. He said. I see. But if this is going where I think it is, those pirates are most likely dead by now. Luffy thought, feeling sorry for Laboon. However, island whales normally swim together in pods, but Laboon saw the pirate crew as his pod. The pirates stayed for a few months to fix their damaged ship. I managed to become good friends with them while they were staying. Crocus said with a faint smile. Could you please take care of Laboon for 23 years? Was what they asked when they left. Once we've sailed around the world, we'll come back for him no matter what. Laboon perfectly understood their intentions, so he waited patiently for them here. He explained. So that's why he keeps bellowing and bashing his head against the red line. Nami said mostly to herself than anyone else. That's right. Crocus replied. It's been 50 years since then, but Laboon still believes that his friends will come back one day. Crocus said with a slightly somber tone, shocking the pirates. Scene skip. The pirates, with their two captives, and Crocus slowly rode the waterway that was built inside of Laboon's stomach to the exit. This is some waterway. Zoro idly commented, slightly amazed at the steel corridor. I'm amazed that you managed to dig out such a large hole and live in here. Is this another way for you to have fun? Nami said with a slight frown. It's a hobby of mine as a doctor. I may not look like much, but I'm a real doctor. I used to run a clinic at the Cape a long time ago. I also got a few years as a ship doctor under my belt. Crocus commented as his island slowly bobbed through the waterway. Seriously? Then why not be a doctor for us? Usopp asked curiously, the ship stopping in front of a steel door that led outside. That's nonsense, I'm too old for that stuff. Crocus said as he climbed the ladder to a crank that would open the doors. So you're a doctor and you live inside of this whale? Nami asked curiously. Yeah, with a creature this big, it's impossible to treat it properly from the outside. Crocus explained, spinning the crank to open the door. I'm opening the door so it might be a little bright. Crocus warned as the doors creaked open. When the doors opened the ocean water poured out, most of the crew let out relieved breaths. Finally back outside. Usopp exclaimed, Johnny and Yasaku next to him. I can see the real sky now. Johnny said with a wide grin. It's so blue. Yasaku said. What do we do with these two? Zoro asked, referring to their two captives. Just throw 'em overboard. Luffy said with an indifferent shrug. Alright. Zoro said, grabbing them by the scruffs of their shirts and hucking them overboard. The two landed with a splash, waking up with a shock and a sputter. Where are we? Mr. Nine sputtered in panic. Is this stomach acid? Miss Wednesday shouted, splashing about. No, this appears to be the real ocean, Miss Wednesday. Mr. Nine said, finally getting himself upright. Those pirates probably knocked us out, Mr. Nine. Miss Wednesday exclaimed with a frown on her face. Who were you two again? Luffy asked curiously from the ship. That's none of your business. Mr. Nine and Miss Wednesday shouted in response before calming down. But wait, Miss Wednesday, it may be their business, seeing that they're pirates, after all. Mr. Nine said with a smirk. Very true, Mr. Nine. Our organization may have use for you, pirates. So prepare yourselves. Miss Wednesday exclaimed. Then we bid you goodbye, hillbilly pirates. Mr. Nine exclaimed as he and Miss Wednesday swam away. Heed this, old man. Miss Wednesday shouted. That whale will ours for the taking. Crocus simply shook his head silently in response. So her name's Miss Wednesday? Sanji asked to himself dreamily. What a beautiful little enigma you are. They probably dropped this. Luffy muttered as he held a log pose in his hand, looking at it with a studious eye. Are you sure about letting them go? They might come back for the whale. Negico said with a worried tone. Even if I didn't let them go, there'd be other rogues to take their places. Crocus said, still looking in the direction the two left. But to think it's been waiting 50 years for his friends to come back. Sanji said, looking up at the whale. And it still believes that they'll be coming back? Sanji asked, impressed by the whale's trustworthiness in its friends. Even if the whale believes in its friends, it's no use, Luffy said, lounging on a nearby rock, they're all most likely dead and decayed by now. He said bluntly. They're not coming back no matter how long this whale waits. Why do you have to say such cold things? Usopp snapped at Luffy, Yusaku standing with him. Yeah. They still might come back. Yusaku exclaimed with a frown on his face. Crocus sat silently, seemingly debating what to say before he spoke. The truth is far more brutal than it seems. He said, bringing attention to him. Those pirates already left the Grand Line, I heard from a reliable source. Crocus said, shocking some of the pirates. What? Usopp stuttered in shock. So they just left the whale behind, but that would mean that they'd have to go through the calm belt. Nami exclaimed. Yes, that's why I don't know if they survived or not. Crocus replied. Even if they did, they'd never dare to return to the chaotic sea of the Grand Line. He said with a serious tone. A place where common sense means nothing, that place is the Grand Line, and it rules with fear over the faint-hearted. Huffing out a cloud of smoke, Sanji spoke. So basically, those cowards were more concerned about their own skins than their promise. He said blandly. So they just left the whale behind even though it's been waiting patiently for 50 years, how could they be so cruel? Usopp shouted, outraged. If that's the case, then why not tell the whale the truth? Nami asked curiously. I've already told him everything, but he refused to listen to a single word I say. Crocus explained. Laboon's been bellowing at the red line and smashing his head against it, as if saying that his friends are still alive and that they'll come back. I've tried time and time again to tell him the truth, but he never listens. Crocus said. What a whale, still waiting here even after being betrayed. Sanji said, slightly impressed with Laboon's tenacity. Even though it's no use. Usopp muttered in agreement. That's exactly it, it's because he'll lose all reason that he's in denial about his friends. He's more terrified that he'll lose the meaning of his waiting here over anything else. Crocus explained. Laboon's home is back in West Blue, but it's too late to go back now, that's why his only hope are the very friends he came here with in the first place. I feel sorry for this whale and all, you've also been betrayed if you think about it, so why not just leave the whale behind? Sanji asked curiously. Just look at the scars on his head, if he continues to bash his head against the red line, he'll die. We may have an odd relationship, but he's still my comrade and he has been for the past 50 years, I can't just leave him to die. Crocus explained. There was a moment of silence that was shattered by the sound of sandals smacking against something. Everyone looked and saw that the sound was coming from Laboon, or more precisely, Luffy, who was running up Laboon at high speeds. What's he up to now? Sanji asked with a sweat drop on his head. He's way too reckless. Negico commented. Back with Luffy, he'd just reached the top of Laboon's head and found a fresh wound. Alright. A fresh wound. Luffy exclaimed, jumping up and pulling his fist back, turning it black with HAKI. Kick-ass I can, he exclaimed, throwing his fist forward and crashing it on Laboon's head. Did he just punch the whale? Zoro asked to no one in particular. I think he did. Sanji said blandly. Laboon was shocked still for a second and started to sweat before he bellowed in pain and anger. You. Laboon started thrashing wildly back and forth, trying to shake Luffy off of his head. What the hell is he doing? The crew shouted in anger and questioning. Crocus looked shocked and angry, but a bit of confusion as well. Whoa. Damn it. Stop moving, you fucking whale. Luffy exclaimed as he tried his best to not get thrown off of Laboon. After a few moments of violent thrashing, Laboon seemed to have enough and jumped out of the water towards the lighthouse headfirst. Luffy could only think, damn it. Before Laboon crashed into the lighthouse with a thundering boom that shook the island. Laboon jumped back into the water and looked ready to launch back at Luffy when he shouted out. It's a tie. Laboon stopped in confusion, blinking, the crew and Crocus being confused as well. I'm pretty strong, ain't I? Luffy asked with a wide smirk, getting a blink from the whale. Laboon stayed silent, but Luffy took it as a response. Our fight isn't over, so we gotta finish it sometime else. He exclaimed with a grin. Everyone watching was silent, still shocked about the short but intense fight. Your old friends may be dead and gone, but I'm your new rival. He shouted with his grin still in place. And once my crew and I have sailed around the world, we'll be back to see you again. Laboon's eyes started to water and brim with tears, causing the spectators to smile at the scene. And when we're back, we'll fight again. Luffy shouted out. Laboon opened his mouth wide and let out a deep bellow. But instead of it being filled with loneliness and depression, it was filled with excitement and anticipation of the future battle, and the joy of having another friend to look forward to seeing again. Scene skip. Finally done. Luffy exclaimed, wiping some sweat off of his paint-stained forehead with his paint-covered arm, not really helping anything. This Jolly Roger is a promise to our fight, alright. He shouted up at Laboon, who had a giant Sub-Zero Pirate's Jolly Roger painted on his scarred forehead. When we come back I don't want to see that mark scuffed off, so don't crash against the red line anymore, got it? Buo. Laboon bellowed in what seemed to be acceptance, causing Luffy to grin. Good. Luffy put the giant paintbrush in one of the large buckets and turned to Crocus to initiate small talk and accept an offered drag when, a pair of girlish screams knocked him and everyone out of their tasks. What's the matter? You're being noisy. Luffy complained with a frown, wiping his face with a rag. What's wrong, my dear Namiswain, Nojikochwaaaa, and if it's about a meal, I just made one. Sanji exclaimed, dancing over to the two women with plates impressively stacked on his elbows and head. I guess I'll just take a brief break from making ammo and eat. Usopp grumbled as he climbed up onto the cape. The compass is broken, it's out of control. Nejiko exclaimed, looking at the compass with Nami. Nami, I already told you the Grand Line doesn't follow common sense and that your little compass might as well just be a piece of shit on the ocean floor out here with how crazy the magnetic fields are here. Luffy explained, reminding Nami of their first encounter as he sat down at the table, grabbing some fish to eat. What do you mean by that? Nami asked confused. What I mean is that all of the Grand Line has this weird magnetic field around each island within it and all it does is fuck up a normal compass. Luffy explained, placing a piece of elephant tuna in his mouth before sliding the fork out of his mouth. So you have to use this thing called a log pose to lock onto each island's magnetic field while you're on a different island and points directly to the island. He said. That doesn't sound too difficult. Nejiko said with a tilt to her head. It wouldn't be too difficult if reality wasn't such a cruel bitch all the time. Luffy said with a frown. The things that make navigating the Grand Line a fucking pain is the unpredictable weather, wind currents, and that the ship can be turned 180 degrees without you even knowing. He said with a frown, remembering his first moments in the Grand Line with Shanks, continuing to munch on the food. Seriously? Nejiko asked, stunned. Oh, absolutely. It can go from perfect spring weather one moment to an insane waterspout with lightning and thunder the exact next. Luffy said, unknowingly eating the last bit of the elephant tuna. So what's our first island we have to get to? Nejiko asked curiously. Well, that depends, Luffy explained. There are 7 different paths that can be randomly chosen by this log pose here. He said, holding up the log pose that Mr. Nine and Miss Wednesday had. Nami reached out and snatched the log pose from Luffy's hand that dropped back to the table. So this is a log pose. She muttered to herself. Luffy continued on his explanation. And no matter what, the log pose will always lead to the final island, Raftel. He said with a serious tone at the last word. The only man to confirm this island's existence was the Pirate King, Gold D. Roger himself. Then does that mean that One Piece is on that last island? Yasaku exclaimed in excited questioning with Johnny and Usopp next to him, equally excited. Who knows, Luffy shrugged, holding some of the elephant tuna's skeleton in between his teeth, but we'll find out once we get there, won't we? He asked his crew with a smirk. Speaking of which, we should probably head out, we're already out of food. Luffy said, placing the skeleton piece back on his plate. You already ate the food, Sanji, Johnny, Yasaku, and Usopp shouted out in shock. Alright, log pose, I'll be sure to take care of you, you carry the fate of our travels after all. Nami said with a smile. Why you shitty icehead, all of that food was, Sanji growled in anger and frustration, rounding his leg around for a roundhouse kick before lashing out with a roar, for Namison to enjoy. His foot blurred with speed and was going to crash into Luffy's head if he didn't lean forward, feeling the air from Sanji's kick rustle his hair a bit. But it was accompanied by the sound of shattering glass and deafening silence followed immediately after. Nami's expression was blank before she turned to Sanji and Luffy, the former looking more nervous, while the latter looked calm. In a flash, Nami had grabbed the two, catching even Luffy off guard, and threw them both towards the ocean, shocking all present, knowing of Luffy's fruit powers. You two just cool your heads in the sea. She shouted in anger, storming away from the edge in a rage. Ice Age. Luffy's voice sounded off from the sea, stopping Nami in her spot as she remembered who she threw into the sea, then began to sweat. In Nami's opinion, Luffy could be downright terrifying whenever he wanted to be, mostly if his patience was tested or his spot as captain was questioned. So, when she realized that she threw him over the edge, quite literally in fact, she was scared shitless. Nami tried to hurry back to the ship but stopped when she felt Luffy's HAKI behind her. "Hey Nami, could you meet me in my room in a few minutes?" Even though the question itself didn't sound threatening, the meaning behind them did. Luffy walked past her, dumping Sanji's body off of his shoulder and onto the ground, eliciting a grunt of annoyance from the blonde chef. "You really screwed up this time." Zoro's gruff voice called out from the table, drawing shocked stares from everyone. "What you just did was basically an attempt on his life," he said offhandedly, drawing a glare from Nami. "Shut up Zoro," she said shortly, even though there was truth behind his words. "Be mad at him all you want, but he is right, Nami," Nijiko said from her spot. "He's the captain, and if he was a cold-hearted bastard, he would have killed you by now," she said with brutal honesty. Sighing, Nami began to walk to the Going Merry with a sense of foreboding. Scene skip. Luffy was sitting at his desk, leaning back in his chair, looking at Shanks' eternal pose with a slight frown on his face, recalling Nami's behavior. Why does she act that way? He thought to himself curiously. His thoughts were cut off by Nami's presence coming aboard the ship and approaching his cabin door. He thought that she was going to open the door, but was slightly surprised when she lightly knocked, possibly remembering the last time she barged in. "Come in," he called out, hearing the door open and shut behind him. "Have a seat on the bed," he said, placing the eternal pose on his desk and standing. Looking at his orange-haired navigator, he noticed she seemed really tense and nervous. "You can relax, your punishment won't be that bad," he said before taking a thinking pose, "or it might be from your perspective," Luffy muttered. "But that won't come until after our discussion," he said, somehow making Nami more nervous. "What did you want to talk about?" Nami asked quietly. "For one, you can relax," Luffy said with a slightly stern tone. "Second, I want to talk about your attitude," he said, sitting next to Nami on the bed. "What do you mean?" Nami asked, confused but slightly scared. "I'm not quite sure how to put it, but sometimes, it seems that you doubt or even undermine my ability and position as the captain of this crew," he explained, turning to look at her. "And I'm curious as to why," he said with a raised brow. Nami stayed silent for a few moments, obviously thinking of the best answer. "I guess it's just a rapid change of pace for me. I mean, for most of my life, I had to jump between pirate crews and steal from them and deal with a tyrannical fishman breathing down the back of my neck until at least a month ago, and I guess I just feel so free, I guess, it's just weird," Nami explained, getting uncomfortable near the end. Luffy sighed and leaned forward on his knees. "Nami, lem explain how I act as captain," he said. "You could say that I'm kind of like a father that just wants the best for his kids. I let you do basically whatever you want, as long as it's within reason," he explained. "But if you slip up, I'll give you at least one chance, then I'll need to talk with you, understand?" Luffy said, asking for clarification. "Yeah," Nami said with a nod, then looking at him. "Luffy, I'm sorry for how I've acted. In retrospect, it was really disrespectful and kind of reckless," Nami said with an apologetic tone. "Hey, it's alright, just don't let it happen again and keep your anger in check, it could really help in the future," Luffy said, standing from his spot on the bed. "But, here's the worst part for you." The last sentence got Nami straight back to uncomfortableness and became stiff as a board once again. "Now, I've got a punishment already planned for you and you'll absolutely hate it, possibly," Luffy said, making Nami fearful. "Until we get to the, let's say fourth island of the Grand Line, you have to give me 50% of any and all treasure we come across and I will watch over you more carefully when you split apart everyone's allowance," Luffy explained, seeing the growing shock and fear on her face. After Luffy finished, Nami was deathly silent for a few moments, actually worrying him. "Nami?" he asked in a worried tone, waving a hand in front of her face, still receiving no response. "Shit, I think I broke her," he muttered to himself. "FFFF. Nami stuttered quietly. "SHH. Luffy quietly said, taking her by the shoulders and slowly lowering her back onto his bed. "Nami, you just relax right here, I'm gonna go get Kaya and be right back," he quietly said to the still unresponsive navigator, stepping out of his cabin and heading towards Kaya, who was still on the ship reading a medical book. "Hey Kaya." The blonde nurse perked her head up and looked at Luffy curiously. "What's wrong Luffy-san?" she asked with a tilt to her head. "I may have possibly broken Nami," Luffy said with an uncomfortable tone, scratching the back of his head. "What do you mean by that?" Kaya asked with rapt attention now, setting the book down and hurrying into Luffy's room to check on Nami, who was still muttering to herself. Kaya placed her hand on Nami's forehead, then checked her pulse to see if it was irregular, then sighed in relief. "She's just overreacting, nothing's wrong with her," she explained as she stood up and began to walk out of Luffy's room. Sighing, Luffy followed Kaya back outside and headed to where everyone else was with her. Before he was out of the door, Luffy turned back to Nami. "Be sure to put the money back when you leave," he said, hearing a slight groan of disappointment and shuffling around as he left. When Luffy made it back with everyone else, Nami and Toe, he saw that the weird duo from earlier on their knees with serious expressions on their faces. "What's happening here?" Luffy questioned. "These two want to ride to their hometown, Whiskey Peak," Negico explained. I see," Luffy said, humming to himself and studying the blue-haired woman with narrowed eyes. "For some reason, I feel like there's more to her than meets the eye," he thought suspiciously. "Don't you two have your own log pose?" he asked it too, already knowing what happened to it. "Yes we did, but we seem to have dropped it over here," Mr. Nine said, his eyes glancing around for it. "Oh, right. Well, I'm sorry, but my chef shattered your log pose," Luffy said with an apologetic tone, causing the duo to almost shout at him, "but luckily I have a spare log pose in my cabin, so we'll just use that one," Luffy said, causing them to bow on their knees with grateful expressions on their faces. "We are in your debt," they said in unison. "But before we do go, who are you two?" Luffy asked curiously. "I'm sorry, but we cannot say, for our organization's motto is mystery, but if you help us back to our town, we'll find a way to repay you," Miss Wednesday exclaimed with her head to the ground. "You shouldn't listen to these two, Luffy, they're nothing but trouble," Croca said with a distasteful tone and a frown on his face. After a moment of silent thought, Luffy made a decision. "Alright, you two can come along, just don't cause trouble or you're overboard," Luffy warned with a slight glare. "The eyes?" "Of course sir," the two exclaimed with fearful voices. "Good, now, our log pose should be ready in a few minutes, so everyone get ready to set sail," Luffy ordered, his crew jumping into action. "You two, come with me," Luffy said, motioning to Mr. Nine and Miss Wednesday. "Just know that you aren't privileged guests on my ship, so you won't be getting any special treatment." The two nodded in understanding. "Good," Luffy said, satisfied as he walked to the ship. "Scene skip, the log pose is ready," Nami exclaimed from the front of the ship. "Is it pointing towards the island you want to go to?" Crocus asked, getting a nod from Nami in return. "It's pointing directly at Whiskey Peak and we're ready to head out," Nami said with a smile. "Are you sure you want to go to Whiskey Peak just because of a couple ruffians, Luffy? This is the only chance to change your path," Crocus said. "Don't worry about it, Crocus, if I don't like it, I'll just go around the world and change my course that way," Luffy said with a smirk, causing Crocus to smile. "I see," he said, almost nostalgically. "Anyway, see ya again, Crocus, we gotta head out," Luffy said. "See you too, Luffy," the old man said in farewell as they sailed away. "I'll be back, Laboon," Luffy shouted with a grin, waving towards Laboon, who bellowed in response. And so began their journey into the Grand Line, the road to One Piece. Chapter 15. Aboard the Going Merry, Luffy, Zoro, and Negico were sitting on the deck with Luffy in front of them both. They had just set sail from the Twin Capes, and Luffy had the two on deck with him so that he can train them as promised. "First of all, I want to explain to you two how I want you guys to train with your weapons," Luffy said before training his gaze on Zoro. "Zoro, I want you to meditate with that cursed blade you got for at least an hour, daily. It will help with you being able to control it and you could also improve your Kenbenshoku haki as well," Luffy explained. Zoro nodded in acceptance, casting a glance at Kitetsu. Turning to Negico. "Negico, for your training, you and I will have a 1-hour sparring session with some tips every day so that you can get used to your rapier," he said, noticing the shock on Negico's face. "What?" he asked, bewildered at Negico's expression. "I'm supposed to fight you?" she asked with a hint of fear in her voice. "Of course, the best way to learn is with first-hand experience," Luffy explained simply. "Plus, it's best to fight someone who knows how to use a rapier, don't you think?" Luffy asked with a small grin. "Do guess, but go easy on me, okay?" Negico asked warily. "I was going to anyway," Luffy said, letting Negico visibly relax. "Alright, let's get started, Zoro, we're going to need this deck, alright?" he asked, gaining a nod from Zoro, who stood and climbed up to the crow's nest. Looking to Negico with a small smirk, Luffy asked. "You ready?" "As ready as I'll ever be," Negico said with a feeling of foreboding as she stood from her spot and walked and stood in front of Luffy, her rapier drawn. "Alright, Negico, are you ready?" Luffy asked, freezing his own rapier into his hands. "Yes, but before we start, I have a serious question," Negico said, lowering her weapon, Luffy doing the same in curiosity. "What is it?" he asked back. "How does your arm work?" Negico asked, motioning to his frozen arm. "Like, what if your powers are somehow restricted? Then what happens to it?" she asked. "Well, if that ever happens, then my arm just won't move anymore because it's still ice, even though I move it with my ability," he answered. "So if my powers are restricted then this arm will only be a nuisance until it thaws out and melts," Luffy said, nodding his head down at his frozen arm. Oh, that's kind of interesting. Nezuko said, happy with the answer. I guess, now then, let's get started. Luffy said, dropping into a stance and aiming his sword at Nezuko with a hand behind his back. Alright then. Nezuko said with nervousness. As she held her sword in front of her with both hands. On guard. Luffy exclaimed, rushing forward at blinding speeds and thrusting his blade forward, only for Nezuko to duck below the strike from fearful instinct of getting pierced through the face. Still shocked, Nezuko stood back up and backed away from Luffy, still holding her weapon with both hands. Alright, first tip. Luffy said, standing from his stance. Never ever hold your rapier with both hands, it's only meant to be held in one hand, like I am. He instructed, Nezuko following his advice and releasing her left hand from the hilt. Now, let's keep going. Luffy said, dropping back into a stance and started lightly, for him anyway, sparring with Nezuko. And during that sparring session, Nezuko learned that trying to parry one of Luffy's thrusts would earn her a sore arm for a while. She also learned that jumping too far back could earn her a few quick strikes to her hamstrings, deadening her leg for a minute or two, and finally, she learned that she believed she would rather be struck with a sharp rapier than a blunt ice rapier any day. After the training, or torture as Nezuko would call it, the crew was sitting at the table, waiting for their food, while their two guests were off in the corner. Nezuko was laying her upper body on the table while some of the crew looked on worriedly. Look at it this way, Nezuko, Luffy said, bringing the lavender-haired woman's attention to him, pain is just a way of showing you're still alive. Plus, with me as your teacher, you learn a lot faster than some third-rate instructor. He said, lightly patting Nezuko on the shoulder, making her wince and grunt in pain. I know but it still hurts. Nezuko complained, her face still in the table. Boy, Luffy, I know you want to make sure Nezuko can be strong and fight with us, but go easy on her. Usopp said with a concerned glance at the lavender-haired woman. Yeah, Luffy, Najikachwin shouldn't even need to fight, for I will be her knight in shining armor and protect to my last breath. Sanji said with a fist on his chest. Just shut up and keep cooking, Curlibro, you're so annoying. Zoro said with annoyance. What did you just call me? Sanji asked with anger in his voice, glaring at Zoro. Sanjikun Nami called out sweetly, bringing the blonde chef's attention to her. Could you please hurry with the food, I'm feeling quite famished. She said with a small pout. Yes. Very well, my beautiful Angel, Sanji said with a pink pulsing heart replacing his eye, switching his attention back onto cooking the food, all the while singing in a lovesick tone to himself. Hey Nami. Luffy called out with a minuscule tone of mocking in his tone. Yes. Nami asked back, for some reason getting a feeling of foreboding in her gut. Would you please check the log pose really quick? He requested, motioning to the pose on her wrist with a slight mischievous glint in his eye, only noticed by Zoro. What's so funny to him right now? He thought before looking at Nami, whose eyes were wide with shock and surprise. Looking back at Luffy, Zoro noticed that he put his fingers in his ears. This only piqued Zoro's curiosity more, but he soon got his answer. Aye. Nami's high-pitched horrified scream pierced the eardrums of all but Luffy, who had plugged his ears beforehand. Nami, what the hell was that about? Usopp asked, confused, scared and a bit dazed. We need to turn the ship around. Nami shouted as she shot up from her seat. What? Why are we going back? Johnny asked curiously. We aren't going back. Luffy said, deeming it safe for him to unplug his ears. The ship was turned around. How does that happen? Kaya asked with a tilt to her head. I don't fucking know, it's just how paradise works. Luffy said with a shrug. It's exactly as your captain said, stupid girl, the Grand Line doesn't follow normal rules. Miss Wednesday said with a smirk, enraging Nami. You two aren't guests here, so start helping and turning the ship. She shouted, grabbing the two guests by their collars and throwing them outside with the rest of the crew, except for Nezuko and Luffy, getting into gear. And what about you, Luffy? Nami asked, still slightly annoyed, turning to her captain who shrugged. It seems like you have everything under control here, just get us back on course and heading to Whiskey Peak. Luffy said, standing from his seat and going to the rudder. But just in case we need it, I'll just watch the rudder and turn when needed. He said, placing his hand on the rudder. Alright, but seriously, next time you train Nezuko, please go a little easier on her. Nami asked with a pleading tone as she walked out to the deck to instruct the crew on what to do. Why did you really want to stay back? Nezuko asked with her chin on the table after a few moments of silence. You'll see in a bit. Luffy answered with a smirk on his face, slightly confusing Nezuko. After a few minutes, the ship was back on track, which was accomplished by much confusion, shock, and frustration. Soon after, the whole crew filed back into the kitchen, looking exhausted or frustrated. So, how was the first few minutes of paradise? Luffy asked smugly, sitting back down at the table. Shut up, Luffy. Please. Usopp groaned out in complete exhaustion. Barely holding back laughter, Luffy looked and saw that Nami was shooting an annoyed glare at him. "What?" he asked, sounding offended and innocent with his hand on his chest, though feeling the complete opposite. "You knew what was happening, didn't you?" Nami asked with a scowl on her face. "Maybe I did, maybe I didn't," Luffy said indifferently with a shrug, only further increasing the navigator's annoyance. "Hey, I know you're annoyed with me, but I already told you that this place doesn't follow common sense, so you should have expected something crazy to happen. It doesn't mean I have to like it though," Nami said with a downtrodden tone, knowing that Luffy was right. "I guess I should try to find out who those two work for now. I hope I don't end up being too rough on them," Luffy thought, glancing at the two mysterious people before his gaze hardened. "They may be possible threats to me and my crew." "You too," Luffy said, pointing his now serious look at their two guests, making them jump in surprise and slight fear. "I have a few questions to ask you both, come with me to my cabin," he said, standing from the table, the two following him in fear of being killed or forced to go with him. "I have a bad feeling about this," Usopp said with a few others agreeing and a collective shiver running up most of their backs. In Luffy's cabin, Luffy was sitting in his office chair with Miss Wednesday and Mr. Nine on his bed in front of him. The two were shaking in fear not only because Luffy looked intimidating as all hell right now, but also because he had frozen the door shut with a foot-thick sheet of ice, enclosing them in cold temperatures. "Now, I'm only going to ask you a few simple questions, alright?" "Alright," Luffy asked, not waiting for a response. Mr. Nine and Miss Wednesday were both noticeably tense, which Luffy seemed to notice. "First question," Luffy said, startling the two out of their silence. "Who do you work for?" he asked simply, being answered by Mr. Nine. "We already told you. Our organization the fake royalty was stopped by an intense look and a firm stomp on the wooden floor from Luffy." A short moment of silence passed before Luffy sighed and closed his eyes. "If you recall my question, I asked who you worked for, not what organization," Luffy said with a serious tone. "I'll ask again. Who do you work for?" he asked, opening his eyes and leveling a glare at the two. "His name is Mr. Zero," Mr. Nine exclaimed in fear at the cold glare from the man before him. "Good," Luffy said with a small, satisfactory nod. "Next. Does this Mr. Zero have a partner income?" When all he got in return was silence and looks directed at the floor, making him lower his head the slightest bit in a nod. "So he does. What is this person's name?" he asked. A few tense moments of silence passed before Miss Wednesday broke and spoke. "Her name is Miss All Sunday." "Okay, I feel like we're getting somewhere," Luffy said with a slight satisfactory tone. "This next part, however, depends wholly on your cooperation with me, understood?" He got two terse nods in response. "Good, now what is your boss's name?" he asked bluntly. "We told you, his name is Mr. Zero." Miss Wednesday was cut off by a small but substantial force, forcing some of her breath out of her. "I mean his real name, Baroque Works," he said with a quiet but serious tone, shocking the two at his knowledge of their organization name. "We can't tell you," Mr. Nine stuttered out before he felt more of breath forced out of him by a slightly greater force. "What is Mr. Zero's real name?" Luffy asked with a more forceful pushing more of his Hashoku haki out in a small and weak, but constant wave. "Why do you want Tonkin know?" Miss Wednesday managed to stutter out. "Because he may be a potential danger to me or my crew if he's leading a criminal organization such as yours," Luffy explained, still pushing out his Hashoku haki. "Now, tell me, who is Mr. Zero?" he asked, exerting a bit more haki against the two, making them sweat pellets and start gasping for air. Mr. Nine tried to stutter out a denial, but was cut off by Luffy. "The only things I want to hear from either of you is either a confession, a submission, or nothing," Luffy said sternly, slowly pushing more and more haki out at a gradually increasing pace, forcing the two to the ground on their hands and knees, before forcing them completely on their sides with sweat pouring from their bodies. This slow increase of haki continued for a few more moments before Miss Wednesday broke with tears slowly trickling down her face. "I'll talk, just please stop," she exclaimed in desperation, and in almost an instant, the immense pressure disappeared, allowing her to take deep gulps of oxygen with her partner, both thankful that they were still alive and sane. "Good, now tell me who Mr. Zero is," Luffy said with a small exhale as the two agents pushed themselves on their knees. "He's one of the 7 warlords, Sir Crocodile," Miss Wednesday exclaimed, shocking Mr. Nine. "The warlord, huh? Interesting," Luffy thought, before noticing Mr. Nine's expression. "Why does your partner look so shocked that you know this?" Luffy asked curiously, glancing at Mr. Nine, then back at Miss Wednesday. Miss Wednesday looked conflicted about whether to tell the Sub-Zero pirate or not about her infiltration of Baroque Works before she sighed. "Because I'm not really a member of Baroque Works," she said, shocking Mr. Nine even more. "I infiltrated Baroque Works to find out who was behind the civil wars in Alabasta," she said with a determined glint in her eyes. Noticing the look in her eyes, Luffy let a small smile grace his face. I see, I think I know your true identity, Miss Wednesday. He said, leaning forward onto his knees. What do you mean? She stuttered in shock and surprise. I mean that I think that you are the princess of Alabasta, Nefertari Vivi. Luffy said, making her eyes widen in absolute shock. If you're wondering how I know, I'm not so ignorant as to not read the newspaper to stay up to date on Grand Line events, especially the fact that the princess of the Desert Kingdom, Alabasta, had gone missing. He said with a dull tone. So, Mr. Nine said, still feeling confused. Oh right, you're still here, I honestly forgot about you. Luffy said with a lazy tone. Are you gonna kill me now that I know? Mr. Nine asked with a nervous tone and sweat dripping down his face. Placing a hand on his chin, Luffy let out a thoughtful hum, narrowing his eyes at Mr. Nine, making Vivi's eyes go wide in shock and Mr. Nine start sweating in fear. After a moment of what seemed like thought, Luffy lost his composure at Vivi's face and started laughing. Oh my god. Your face. Ha ha ha. Luffy managed to say through gasps of breath and loud laughter. I'm not actually going to kill him, so both of you can relax. He said with a smile, standing from his seat. Now let's go, we're pretty close to Whiskey Peak, I'd warrant. Luffy said, walking towards the still frozen door with the two following after him. Skip to Whiskey Peak, those two were an odd couple. Najiko said after Mr. Nine and Miss Wednesday dived off the boat and swam to the island. Holy crap. Look at those giant cacti. Usopp exclaimed, noticing what did indeed look like giant cacti on the island. Doesn't matter, right now we need to focus on docking at the island. Nami said with some impatience in her tone. Oh hey, there's a river, we can dock inland through there. Usopp said from the front of the ship, using one of his sniper eyepieces to zoom in on the river. But it seems really foggy, so I can't see much else than that. He said, sliding his eyepiece back up. Hey, do you think that monsters could be on this island? Johnny asked with a timid voice, making Yasaku and Usopp jump in fear, and they both, including Johnny, looked at Luffy. Don't look at me for answers, I took a different path last time, so this is new to me. Luffy said defensively. But I can assure that there are no monsters on the island. Luffy said, relieving some of the crew. Either way, let's just head in through the river, we have a welcoming party. Welcoming party? Nami said nervously, expecting to be greeted with cannons and rifles. But to say that she was confused would be an understatement when they were greeted, not with violence, but with cheers, confetti, banners and music, as if they were heroes in a parade. Hello, brave pirates. Congrats on making it to the Grand Line. Welcome to our town. What is this? Jin stuttered in shock and confusion at the spectacle before him. Who cares? We're being greeted like heroes. Usopp shouted, waving and blowing kisses to the crowd. Oh. Look at all the beautiful ladies. Sanji shouted with a pink pulsing heart replacing his eye. We're being greeted like heroes. Johnny and Yasaku shouted with large grins on their faces as they waved to the crowds. This is suspicious. Najiko muttered to Nami, who nodded in agreement, looking over the crowd of people. This must be tied to Baroque work somehow. Luffy said to Zoro, studying all of the villagers with a critical eye. Yeah, these people are too happy to see pirates. Zoro agreed, looking at the people suspiciously. After a few more moments of slow sailing to an acceptable docking spot, they set out the gangplank and walked down to solid ground and got greeted by a man who was holding a saxophone and had blonde hair that had thick tubular curls that looked like an old-fashioned powdered wig. Walking up to Luffy, the man greeted the pirate captain. Welco, the man stopped and coughed, welcome to our wonderful town of Whiskey Peak. He said before slightly bowing and greeting and holding his hand out for a handshake. I am the town's mayor, Hie Hie, it's a pleasure to meet you. Gripping the mayor's hand in his own, Luffy gave the man a firm handshake. I'm Luffy, captain of the Sub-Zero Pirates, it's nice to meet you as well. He said, releasing Hie Hie's hand and placing his hand in his hand pocket. May I know how long it takes for the log post to set on this island? He asked curiously. Now, let's not worry about stuff like that, Hie Hie nonchalantly said with a wide smile. For now, let's celebrate your arrival to Whiskey Peak with a grand party. He shouted with his arms wide spread. Gladly. Usopp, Johnny, Yasaku and Sanji shouted with their arms over each other's shoulders with wide grins on their faces. Everyone. Prepare the banquets and let us sing to our heart's content for the brave adventurers of the sea. Hie Hie exclaimed. Night time. The night was dark with a waning gibbous in the starlit night sky and a loud, rambunctious party happening in the town of Whiskey Peak where a small band of pirates docked to let their log pose set onto the next island. Inside the town bar, where the party was in full motion, a long-nosed man with a mug of ale in his hand stood tall, with his face slightly flushed from the alcohol and a blonde girl under his arm. And so I said coolly to him, don't you lay a hand on my friends, you sea king bastards. Usopp said with slightly tipsy look on his face, earning a small chuckle from Kaya. That's cool, Captain USOPP, a group of girls gushed with hearts in their eyes. Well, to be perfectly honest, even I was trembling when we were in the comm belt, he said with a smirk on his face, trembling from excitement of course. Usopp said, earning many cheers of respect from some men. Whoa. These people are insane. Amazing. These guys drank 10 people under the table, each. Someone shouted as Johnny, Yasaku and Jin all held up empty mugs, asking for more. This guy just drank out 12 people. A bar patron shouted as Zoro slammed down a mug of ale, and the man next to him collapsed. I win. He muttered quietly. These two ladies drank out 13 people. Someone else shouted in shock and amazement, looking at Nami and Najiko who had their arms around each other with large smiles on their faces. Haha, they laughed cheerfully. This guy just drank 15 people under the table. A man shouted as someone else collapsed, drunk. This is nothing for me. Luffy blandly stated, looking disinterestedly at his now unconscious drinking challenger. And look at this lady killer. Another man shouted, looking at Sanji, who had 20 women around him. But don't forget this one, she's so beautiful. He shouted, looking dreamily at Alvida with many men swooning at her feet. Ahahaha, Garapoi joyfully laughed. Truly, what a festia mahh, truly, what a festive night this is. He exclaimed before his tone grew a small bit sinister, truly. Scene skip, we can't drink anymore. Johnny, Jin and Yasaku mumbled, all drunk and collapsed on the floor. They collapsed on their 12th. I'm done. Zoro said, slamming his mug down. He just finished off his 14th person. We're done for. Nami and Najiko mumbled in unison after drinking their 15th person under the table. This guy's at his 17th person. It's the sister. Someone shouted, motioning to the dark-skinned nun that was currently challenging Luffy. Already done? I expected more from you guys. Luffy said with a smirk as he finished his mug before the nun. You done yet, sister? I can still go on. He said, barely feeling the effects of the alcohol. I think it'd be best for you to stop while you're ahead. She said, finishing her mug as well with a heavy blush on her face, before her head fell forward and hit the table, signaling her being unconscious. The sister finally fell. This guy's insane. Anyone else? Luffy asked, when he was seeing no one else walk up, he leaned back and fell asleep. Guess I'll just sleep, then. He said as he began to softly snore. Ah, what a great town this is. Usopp exclaimed, falling asleep with a smile on his face and his head on Kaya's lap, who had also fallen asleep. This is surely heaven. Sanji dreamily said, resting on a girl's thighs and gently falling asleep. So nice. Alvida said with a dreamy smile on her face. Looks as if they've finally fallen asleep after all that partying. Garapoi said, looking up at the moon. Oh, how beautifully the cactus rocks are as they dance below the moonlight. He said. Quite the poet, aren't you? A female voice asked from a rooftop near him. Mr.8 a male voice said, as if accompanying the woman's sentence. Oh, it's you. Garapoi said without turning around. And the others? Mr. 9 asked, wondering about the pirates. They've fallen deeply, Mr. 8 said before his expression darkened as well as his tone. To hell that is. Oh, dear Lord Hick, they sure know how to drink and eat. The sister said as she was stumbling out of the bar with a hand to her head. And I was only drinking sparkling barley tea. She groaned as she took off her hood. This Monday? Mr. 8 said, greeting the nun. Is there really a need to stage this huge welcoming party? I mean, they're only a bunch of weak-looking brats. She said in frustration. We should have just crushed them at the harbor, and since we can't count on that whale meat, we can't waste that much food anymore. Ms. Monday said with a click of annoyance. Don't you talk that way about us. Ms. Monday exclaimed. Yeah. At least we tried our best. Mr. 9 agreed. Now, all of you calm down and take a look at this. I've done some homework of my own about this crew. Garapoi said, holding out Luffy's bounty poster with the others. The three were slack-jawed in shock and awe at the 4 bounties. That adds up to over 100 million. Mr. 9 shouted in surprise. And that's not even the whole crew. Ms. Wednesday shouted. But be careful, the captain isn't captain for no reason, he's by far the strongest of the crew and has a devil fruit power. Mr. 8 said with a warning tone, pointing at Luffy's poster. His statement triggered the memory of Mr. 9 and Ms. Wednesday when they were being interrogated by the Sub-Zero captain and unconsciously shivered at the memory. But don't misjudge the others so easily, appearance isn't everything in a pirate. Mr. 8 said before gaining an authoritative tone. Now go and confiscate all of their treasure and tie them up, we lose 30% from the bounty if they're killed, the Navy likes to do their public executions of criminals, after all. He explained. Hate to interrupt you guys, but could you let them sleep a bit longer? A voice from the bar rooftop asked. Yeah, they're probably going to have nasty headaches in the morning. A second voice said. MMR. 8. Ms. Monday. A bounty hunter shouted, bursting out of the bar door with a frantic expression. 2 of their crew escaped. What the? Weren't you 2 out cold earlier? Mr. 8 exclaimed in confusion and shock. True swordsman, the first voice started as his silhouette had raised his blade, which glinted in the moonlight with the second figure's blade. Never allow alcohol to control themselves. It seems you were right all along, Luffy. A bunch of bounty hunters under the guise of a very welcoming village that takes advantage of overconfident rookie pirates. Zoro. Of course I was right, Zoro. In all my life, I've never seen pirates greeted with a party from villagers. Luffy said with realism in his hand. Now, Zoro, how many bounty hunters do you think there are right now? He asked. I'd say about 200, that's a lot. Zoro commented offhandedly, looking down at the large crowd of bounty hunters. I'll say. Luffy said with a chuckle. Either way, this many Baroque Works agents make fine enemies, don't they, Zoro? He asked with a smirk. Yeah, 100 for me and 100 for you. Zoro agreed with a slight bloodthirsty glint in his eyes. How do you know the name of our organization? Ms. Monday exclaimed in shock. Well, when I was still a bounty hunter, I was scouted out by your organization, but of course I rejected. Zoro said with his wolf grin. And I was scouted out by Baroque Works back when I was still with my mentor, and I would have accepted, but they didn't agree to my terms, so I had to refuse as well. Luffy said with a smirk. This is quite shocking, but if they know our secret, then we'll have to kill them. Mr. 8 said with a dark tone. 2 more tombstones must be added to the cactus rock tonight. He shouted before pointing up at Luffy and Zoro. Hurry and kill them. He shouted before stopping in confusion at the now empty space. They're gone. Mr. 9 shouted in shock, looking around frantically with the other bounty hunters. Where are they? Mr. 8 shouted, feeling a small bit panicked as he searched for the 2 pirates, before he and all of the hunters stopped and looked to the center of the crowd, only to see Luffy and Zoro looking towards the top of the bar with false curiosity, before they noticed that they were spotted. Oh, looks like they finally found us. Luffy said with a chuckle. Yeah, now let's get things started. Zoro said with a grin. You bastards. A bounty hunter shouted, aiming at the 2 pirates, along with a numerous amount of others. Shoot them. He exclaimed as they all pulled the trigger, only to have Luffy and Zoro vanish, and the bullets to hit the bounty hunters opposite of each other. You fools. Mr. 8 shouted, sweating bullets. They disappeared again. They're too fast. Just hurry and kill them, there's only 2 of them. Mr. 8 shouted before he stopped as he felt cold steel press against his face and saw a steel blade glinting in the moonlight and slicing through his hair. Are you sure that you only want to add 1 tombstone to that rock tonight? Zoro asked menacingly with a wide smirk on his face, standing right behind Mr. 8. There he is. One of the hunters shouted as he and about a dozen others aimed their rifles at Zoro, forgetting about Luffy. Stop, you fools. Are you planning to shoot me as well? He shouted in panic, only to be ignored as they all almost pulled their triggers. I said stop. He exclaimed as he pulled out a saxophone and spun around with a shout. I garappa. He blew air into the sax, shooting out dozens of shotgun pellets, wounding and killing the aiming hunters. Is that thing a fucking shotgun? Luffy asked Zoro, both of them hiding around a corner. Yeah, it is. Talk about dangerous, huh? Zoro asked rhetorically. It looks like we'll have to deal with them ourselves. Mr. 9 said with a dangerous tone. Let me know in the comments below if you guys want the next part. Also check out my other video that has been shown and left. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this video, please like and share this video. And have a fantastic day. Bye.